Welcome back to the Conclusion of the Matter podcast. I'm joined as always by Ren and Ryan, and I'm Robbie. Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, the conclusion, when everything has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments. For this applies to every person, for God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. As always, we want to thank everyone for listening. If you have questions for topic suggestions or just general questions about the Bible that you would like for us to look at in future podcasts, we try to include as many of those as possible in all of our podcasts to be able to answer those questions. And so, in fact, today is one of the exceptions to the rule, I believe, on that, though. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Ren, and he's going to introduce what today's topic is going to be.
Yeah, well, again, as Robbie mentioned, glad that everybody is tuning in. We're going to be returning to one of our reoccurring segments that we have done. Have we done this one since the first season?
Message Behind the Music?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've done one each season, I think. I don't think we've done it this season.
We haven't done it.
Yeah.
Well, we did one towards the beginning of this season.
I feel like we usually do like 2, sometimes 3 a season,
Yeah.
give or take.
But yeah, returning to that old, not old, but the rusty, trusty message behind the music. And today,
Rusty, trusty.
Yeah. You know, like an old pickup truck that's just
Oldie but goodie?
old but reliable
Oh, okay.
and good. Yeah,
I've heard that related to vehicles, but and songs, oldie but a goodie. Yeah.
I was wondering if we were going to let them get away with that one. Y'all, and you make fun of my idioms.
Hey, that didn't originate with me.
I've never heard that, but continue.
We're going to be looking at a song that we typically sing. We do sing it, I think, pretty regularly.
An old rusty trusty
Yes,
song.
it is. A lot of these songs are. It's called Follow Me by a woman named Ira F. Stanfield. At least I'm assuming that that's a female name. It's not.
It's not, no.
All right. Well, I know there's like Ira Rice,
Yeah.
who was a missionary. That one I've heard can go both ways. But were you about to say something?
Nope.
Oh, okay. We're off to a great start here. But it's a song called Follow Me, and I think as we examine its meaning and its message, I think it's a really great song about, ultimately, I think putting Christ first is really what the whole thrust of the song is. But the first couple of stanzas are really kind of comparing what we think or what we have done and what we might think is really great or grand to what Christ has done for us, and really keeping things, I think, very well in perspective. And something that's a little bit different about this song is there is a chorus to the song, but it's not like a typical chorus where it's just the same thing repeated at the end of every verse. There are obviously some similarities. The last few words are exactly the same, basically exactly the same at the end of all of the choruses, but each chorus kind of represents a different point and has deeper meaning behind it. And so we're going to go ahead and I guess just jump in here with verse 1, and I'll go ahead and read it, and then we can come back through and dissect it and look at different parts of it. There it states, I traveled down a lonely road and no one seemed to care. The burden on my weary back had bowed me to despair. I oft complained to Jesus how folks were treating me, and then I heard him say so tenderly, my feet were also weary upon the Calvary road. The cross became so heavy I fell beneath the load. Be faithful, weary pilgrim, the morning I can see. Just lift your cross and follow close to me. So what do y'all think about this first verse? What stands out?
I really think I was going to go bird's eye view first, and something that stood out to me in this song as a whole is, especially in the verses, it really kind of gets into, I think, a lot of the human mentality with different things, whether that be trials or different, things that we're doing for God. We'll look at some of those other aspects later, but I think there's a lot of things that we go through in this life that we get bogged down with, that we feel like we're getting beat over the head with, and different, whether that be temptations or just different things that are challenging in our lives, sometimes interactions with other people, sometimes spiritual challenges, all of those different things tend to weigh on us. And I think it's also an important reminder that the sufferings that we go through, that Christ knows a little bit about suffering himself, and there's nobody better that can support us. And I think that's one of the points that the writer's kind of saying here. But obviously, we didn't suffer in the same way that Christ did, but Christ can empathize with all of the things that we're going through. I think of in Matthew chapter 4 when he was tempted, and of course, in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, that we don't have a high priest who can't sympathize with us, but was tempted and tested just like we were, yet without sin. And I really like also how verse 16 goes right after that. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And so you see that in the song here, that we go through all of those things, but we have somebody that we can relate to, and that should give us that boldness to look to him for an example to guide us when we're going through those challenges.
Yeah.
But also on the flip side of that, I think sometimes we, as humans, have a tendency to kind of pout and sulk a little bit sometimes too. At least I've found that to be the case for me. So I think whichever interpretation you want to take there, I think both of them can be equally true.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And kind of what you mentioned there at the end was what stood out to me is that kind of like
Sometimes
we self-pity. Yeah. And it immediately reminded me of Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19, there in verse 10, where he talks about, I've been so jealous for you, God. I've been so zealous for you. I've been teaching. I've been proclaiming the word, and nobody's listening. And I'm the only one that's left that's trying to do this. And as the writer of this song expresses, that lonely road. And a lot of times living the Christian life, it really does feel pretty lonely. Even sometimes like, you come to worship and you're assembling with 150 or so different people, at least for us here at Collinsville, and you can still have those feelings of loneliness and isolation. And so that very common, I think, human experience. And as he goes on, nobody seemed to care. The burden on my weary back had bound me to despair. Again, just kind of, there's truth to all of this that he's saying, as Robbie was pointing out, but also I think there is a little bit of that layer of woe is me. Again, that it's not to say that the Christian life is easy. There's certainly a lot of trials. There's a lot of discouragement, and it's hard work in a lot of respects. A lot of hard work, whether you're working on yourself personally, trying to make changes that you need to make, or whether you're trying to help other people make the changes that they need to make. It's certainly, in that sense, burdensome, where it's a lot of work. But as Robbie was pointing out, what we've gone through, and as the song is pointing out, what we've gone through is really nothing compared to what Christ went through. Even as the song stated, it brings our minds back primarily to the cross. And looking at the gospel accounts, I think all of them except for John have direct allusion to Simon the Cyrene being called to help Christ carry the cross up the hill to Golgotha. Because, you consider everything that he had just gone through. He was beaten, he was scourged, he had the crown of thorns placed upon his head. From what I've heard or read about the crucifixion process, there were a lot of times people would die from the scourging process because of how much blood you would lose in that, and then carrying up that cross. And some historians and scholars think that it was just the cross beam that he carried, but I've heard of estimates of that piece alone, I think weighing up to like 80 pounds. And think about carrying that after having suffered extreme,
being beaten 39 times, 40 times.
Yeah, that extreme blood loss, the fatigue, because he didn't sleep at all the night before because he was being dragged from one place to another, appearing before Pilate and the high priest and things like that. Just the sheer exhaustion that he had to have felt. And again, I think the song kind of putting all of that in perspective is, if Christ could endure all of that, then we can endure the feelings of loneliness and fatigue that we may feel in our service to him.
I was just going to say that the Simon Cyrene's in the Synoptic Gospels, John, because I looked it up right before this. But to throw a little history at this, Ira Forrest Stanfill, which I think
Okay.
Forrest
Yeah,
would
that
probably
makes
be
it a
more
little
of a
clearer.
male
Yeah.
name. But anyway, but he wrote this in 1953, and he was at what was it? It was a missionary, what'd they call it? I just read it here. A missionary conference, sorry, a simple word, in Grand Prairie, Texas. And he was listening to a couple of missionaries. They happened to be of the Assembly of God denomination, but their names were Charles and Mary Greenaway. And they had been to Africa for many years, and they were struggling to have any success at converting. And Mary had been dealing with health issues while over there, to the point of where he had admitted defeat. Like, he was so beat down, like, I'm lonely. No one's listening to us. Very similar to what you guys talked about, but when Ira heard this, Ira was dealing with some personal struggles himself. His wife had left him for another man, but he chose to hold out hope that she would reconcile at some point. But he was a very lonely person. So part of this led to him, the very next morning, he penned the words of this song. Part of it because of what they had indicated, and part of it based on his life. And I'll add more nuggets of that as we get to the other verses. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but the main part, and we'll see it later as well, was about the missionary struggles that they were having, is the fact that we're working for Christ, and we don't feel like anything's happening. And it's like, and it does get to that woe is me aspect, I think, a little bit. But what the missionary had said, and while I don't believe in Jesus answering someone miraculous, direct revelation, he said that he had spent a lot of time in prayer, and he got his answer that said, "Why don't you just follow me and leave the results in my hand?" And think about that when we talk about the stuff we do with AMC, the door knocking and all that stuff. It's like, what is our job?
Yeah.
Our job is to present it, and then either they're going to show interest or not. And if they don't show interest, are they rejecting you? Maybe a little bit, but in reality, they're rejecting the Word of God, right? So I think that's a pretty straightforward answer that we could follow as well, is just do what I ask you, and then just leave the results up to me, whether it be evangelism, whether it be living the righteous life. Some of the way we have to live is based upon the New Testament law, right? And it's like, some things, it's like, just do what I ask you, and I'll take care of you. It may not be in this life. You may have to deal with troubles and whatnot, but that's where the meaning behind this song came from for Ira, was listening to them, but also him stepping back and looking at his life and adding pieces in this song as well. But
that's pretty interesting, and especially coming from the perspective of the missionaries, because I know a lot of missionaries who have lived over in, I mean, we know some people in common who have lived in those places, and it's not an easy work.
Right.
And so that really helps understand, I think, a little bit more of the message behind this music.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the more context that we understand about that, the more we can kind of empathize with this song, and the more it becomes more meaningful to us. When we put it in perspective, I mean, so many people deal with different things within ordinary life, such as job loss, broken families, conflict, all kinds of these different things. But also in our spiritual walk, with obviously, Ryan, you brought up evangelism. There can be a lot of things related to that can cause us pain. Maybe we lose relationships that because of that. Just maybe that become family conflict. I mean, there's lots of different things that within our spiritual walks, and also with evangelism, on top of our personal lives, that can cause us perceived pain and just brokenheartedness. And not that those things are invalid, but when we put those things up against the things that Jesus suffered, it puts it in perspective a little bit. Not that those things aren't tragic, especially, I mean, job loss, the loss of life, cancer. There's so many bad things and things that cause heartache in this world that are serious. then that's why we have Jesus, and that's why we have somebody to rely upon.
Yeah.
And it also reminded me a little bit of Job's kind of interaction with God in Job after he had gone through so many different hard times, and then his interaction with God. I don't think that it was in the same tone, but some of the interaction kind of reminded me of this song a little bit too.
Yeah. Well,
at least the first verse.
And kind of going back to the point that both of you guys hit on about, just kind of the general point of trusting God and trusting in him, I think is really made evident at the end of that, I guess technically the chorus of the first verse, where he says, "Be faithful, weary pilgrim, the morning I can see, just lift your cross and follow close to me." And when I initially read that and was thinking about it, I thought of, first of all, the ultimate goal and result of, you might be facing these things, going through these things, but just be faithful because Christ is there, first of all, to help you through them, but also to help you get through and to enter. I think of as the Hebrews writer in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 11, he says, "Let us strive to enter that rest so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience," of continuing to trust in him, following him, because one day you'll be able to rest. You'll have that reward. You'll be rewarded for all of those things that you've gone through in his name.
Well, I think the word pilgrim, we talk about us being, we've referred to that in several episodes, that this is not our permanent place. This is a, as Hebrew writer says, where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob realized they were exiles or strangers in a land, and that's what we are. We're fortunate to live in this country, and we're Americans, but where's our citizenship? Paul says in chapter 3 Philippians verse 20, our citizenship is in heaven, and that should be our number one goal, right? So I think keeping that in mind is just, this is not our permanent destination.
Right.
And there's a lot of things that we don't understand that are going to happen in our lives, and sometimes in the short term we ask God why, or sometimes we blame him, sometimes we don't blame him, but just we can't see ahead like he can see for us. So.
Yeah. You have anything else on that first verse?
Nope.
All right. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that, as you pointed out in the past, is when he's talking about lifting up your cross, he's not talking about, oh, that's the cross I must bear.
Right.
He's talking about, if it comes to the point of death, being faithful to him. I thought of Revelation 2:10 as you read that last part. Be faithful, weary pilgrim. Be faithful, weary pilgrim. I could almost plug that into Revelation 2:10. Be thou faithful until death, weary pilgrim. And or however you want to say it, as John Wayne would say, pilgrim. But look at me doing impersonations, Robbie. But anyway,
I'm rubbing off on everybody.
That's
here.
the one I thought of, is when you say that, is that be faithful until death.
Yeah.
And then, anyway, that was just what I want to point out.
Yeah, and I think he kind of circles back to that at the very end of the song, too.
Agreed.
Yeah. So I'll read the second stanza, second verse here. I work so hard for Jesus, I often boast and say, I've sacrificed a lot of things to walk the narrow way. I gave up fame and fortune, I'm worth a lot to thee. And then I hear him gently say to me, I left the throne of glory and counted it but loss. My hands were nailed in anger upon a cruel cross. But now we'll make the journey with your hand safe in mine. So lift your cross and follow close to me. What do y'all think about this one? There's some similarities between first one and this one, I think, but also some key differences.
I automatically thought of the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, how the Pharisee kind of, got on his high horse talking about all the things that he had done for God. That kind of mentality kind of reminded me of how the second verse started out and kind of mentions how I'm worth a lot to thee, and this and this. So that kind of mentality kind of reminded me of that story.
Yeah. And for me, kind of what I saw in this verse is contrasting man's arrogance with Christ's humility. Because man thinks, well, look at, like you just mentioned with the tax collector, look at, not the Pharisee, look at all that I've done. I'm worth so much to you, recognize how much I've done for you. And it also reminded me of Peter in Matthew 19, after the instance with the rich young ruler. And Christ says, the rich.
We've forsaken all.
Yeah. And Peter says, see, we've left everything and followed you. What then will we have? And I don't want to, I guess, impugn motive here. I don't want to assume that Peter was asking it with this mentality. But given some of the other questions that they've asked in the past and on other occasions, it very well could have been his mentality of, well, we've given up so much for you, Christ. What are we going to get in return? And he, of course, then goes on in verses 28 through 30 to say, first of all, you're going to be blessed physically because of it, but ultimately, at the end of verse 29, you will inherit eternal life. But we do have, I think, that tendency to look at all of these things that I've done. And it also reminds me of Luke, 17:10, where Christ says, even when you've done all that you have been commanded to do, say to yourselves, we are unprofitable or unworthy servants. So it's very easy for us to fall into that arrogant mindset, especially when we're really sincerely working and putting forth our best effort and doing as much as we possibly can. That always has to be tempered, I think, with humility.
I think part of the history comes out in this verse 2. Verse 2 also, not number 2, but because when he talks about I gave up fame and fortune, I don't think I would ever be I didn't give up fame and fortune for the sake of Christ. I think, according to one of the narratives that I read on the beginnings of this, was he was such a good songwriter that apparently his wife wanted him to move towards secular music because it was more lucrative. Wow. As you probably where more lucrative, more earnings, probably potential there. But he wanted to focus and stay on the ministry, gospel music side of things. I don't know if that's why she left him or whatnot, but I think some of this is, while it is a fake conversation, I think part of it, going back to, is maybe he's had these thoughts in his mind at some point. He's like, Lord, I've stuck to writing songs of the ministry versus going out and writing who knows what. And this is how I got repaid. And he's like, but here he's saying, when I stop and think about it, it's like, going back to what was already said in verse 1, is like, Jesus did more than we could ever do. Yeah. And even the stuff that, the talent he had, the only reason he had the talent is because it was given to him by God, right? It wasn't anything he did. Now, he might have taken classes on how to write lyrics or how to write that prose or whatever, but the talent he had was God-given. Nothing he did. And I think it goes back to all of our prior conversations on, no matter what we do, we can't earn salvation anyway. Yeah. And in alignment with, your guys' story of the Pharisee about, oh, look how great I am. And if we compare ourselves with fellow Christians and say, well, I'm not as bad as so-and-so, I only sin a little bit compared to, you know what I mean? And it's like we give ourselves a false sense of entitlement to that salvation, I guess you could say. Yeah. He's just saying that, in his mind, he's like, man, I gave up a lot for you, and I don't have anything to show for it. But then I think that's when Jesus comes back and answers him. Yeah.
It reminded me of the story, or I don't guess story's the right word, but in the Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about that there's going to be a lot of people say, Lord, Lord, have we not done all of these things? Yeah. And he's going to say, I never knew them. And I think part of the reason that he never knew them is because of that mentality, just like the Pharisee. But sometimes even today, I think we have the same, or we have the tendency to point blame on Peter or on, the Pharisee in this story, or all these other people who show, times where they were prideful. But kind of like our earlier part of Matthew, sometimes we don't look at ourselves and think and realize that we're sometimes guilty of the same thing, how we'll go evangelize, or we'll, give a devotional, or we lead singing every week, or whatever we do. And we're almost looking for like validation from somebody when really it shouldn't be anything about that. Or we sometimes, I'm not going to do this because I already did this past Sunday. Yeah. We kind of like are almost like keeping score, even if we're not intentionally doing that. I'm not saying that that's a common thing, but I think that from time to time, may be in our own heads. And I think, maybe it was in the head of the author at the time too. Yeah. But I mean, we could mention a whole lot of verses just about like pride and humility. You know, you think of James 4, think of 1 Peter 5, obviously the few that we've been bringing up, Proverbs 16:18. So, you know, God takes pride and humility very seriously, and we need to make sure that no matter what we're doing, even if it's for God, we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And I mean, there's so many parts of the Sermon on the Mount right after having the right mentality when you pray, when you fast, when you do all of these things. And just like I think Ren brought up, that Jesus was the most humble person, and we need to be a lot more like that than letting our pride or, you know, we've done this and this and this. I'm so valuable to you, God.
Right.
And not let that mentality rule in our hearts.
Yeah. Well, and kind of going back to something you brought up, Ryan, just a moment ago, talking about the comparing ourselves to others, and then the false sense of entitlement to salvation. And the other thing that I think about with this verse of the song is that false sense of entitlement, but to go along with the comparison, that false sense maybe of superiority, where we think we deserve it. But then I think as the song is trying to highlight here, if we compare ourselves to Christ, that again puts things in perspective, and we realize just how undeserving we actually are, because none of us would ever be able to do anything remotely close to what he did. And as the verse describes, it talks about how he left the throne of glory, he counted it all but loss. Philippians 2, you know, verses 3 through 11 especially really hammer that point.
Yeah, it's like Jesus is saying, you gave up fame and fortune.
Yeah.
You know what I gave up?
Yeah,
Heaven.
being in the form of God.
Yeah, and in heaven. I mean, I was already in the
Right.
in glory and all that.
Yeah.
And if you do read that and you think about it, let me rephrase it. If you think about it, you can read over something and but if you stop and really comprehend what he did, it should leave you in dumbfoundedness on like, wow, of what he did. I mean, you know, I think we do that a lot of times when we talk about, Jesus died for us.
Yeah.
I mean, he did more than just die for us. I mean, it was awful, number one.
Talking about the things that Ren listed earlier about like flogging and you know, lack of sleep. Even if he had like, we'll say, scheduled time to sleep where they weren't coming to take him from court case to court case, I mean, do you think he really would have been able to sleep that whole night? And you know, he spent hours praying in the garden. I mean, just
but even
physical,
before that, you know, it's like, but before, I mean, he came to earth not as a rich person. I mean, he lived a humble life. I mean, one that was rejected all along the way, pretty much.
And whenever, what is it, Luke? Is it Luke 3? Whenever they come to present him at the temple, and they give the two turtle doves, because if you trace that back to the Old Testament law, that was the provision God made for if you were really poor. And so it's not like he came and lived, like you were pointing out, a lavish life. It was destitute from the beginning. And it's not like he created a lot of wealth for himself during his ministry, because what is it? Is it Luke 9, where he tells that person who wants to follow after him, he's like, foxes have holes, birds have the nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And
talking about loneliness.
Loneliness and poverty of the utmost form that you could imagine, especially when you bring into consideration what that verse of the song was highlighting in Philippians, where he left heaven.
Just like some of when you put it into context and like really think of all of the things that God has done for mankind, for us as individuals, for even individual churches, all of the things that Jesus endured. And when you put all of that into perspective, and then just like some of the things that I've like found my mind complaining about, or like, well, look what I've done in my life, you know, I'm sure God's probably up there like, if I could roll the eyes out of the back of my head, I would. He said, you know, he's sitting here listening, and I don't know, it just makes me, you know, just like you had said, Ryan, like when you sit there and kind of think about it and dwell on it, it really, whether you want to or not, it kind of gives you that heart of dumbfoundedness, but also like humility to think like, wow, what am I even saying here?
I think the other thing that sticks out in this verse is that his response isn't reprimanding so much as explaining, but then he says, we'll make the journey with your hand safe in mind. I mean, he is not saying you are, you know what I mean?
He's not saying suck it up.
Yeah, exactly. He's saying, but let's go back to verse Robbie you mentioned, verses Hebrews chapter 4, 15 and 16. Jesus knows what we're going through. He understands what we're going through. Has that, when you tell someone, oh, I know what you're going through, you may not know exactly what they're going through. You may have been through something similar. Jesus understands, and he is not going to be. I don't take this verse as him being angry. I don't. Other than him saying he was nailed in anger, that's the only reason that word is in there. He's a loving Savior that understands that it's hard.
Yeah,
it is hard to live the human life. I don't think it was easy for him.
No, I don't think so either. And to me, which I know there's a lot of opinions about this, but whenever he was on the cross and he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" To me, that's a great representation of that humanity, of just how hard his life was. And, there's, like I mentioned, there's opinion about whether or not he was actually forsaken or not, but it showcases that the turmoil.
He felt alone at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see how you get
regardless
around
of what interpretation of that
exactly.
you take. Yeah,
he felt that. Yeah,
absolutely. Anything else there with that verse? The only other thing I was going to mention, which you've already kind of hit on, is the last part of the chorus or verse is very similar. Again, that encouraging message of Christ is with you. Just stay with him, lift up your cross. He'll see you through to the end.
Right. This, and Ryan kind of hit on this. I don't think either verses of this song, he's like really trying to, reprimand anybody. He's just trying to really say like, look, I'm here for you. I understand all of those things. Let's do this, together. Support on me, lean on me.
Yep, absolutely. All right, the last verse then. It says, "O Jesus, if I die upon a foreign field someday, 'twould be no more than love demands. No less could I repay. No greater love hath mortal man than for a friend to die. These are the words he gently spoke to me. If just a cup of water I place within your hand, then just a cup of water is all that I demand. But if by death to living they can thy glory see, I'll take my cross and follow close to thee." The first part of the song reminds me very much so of Peter on the night that Christ was betrayed. And all of the other 11, it states that all of them said this, that, "Lord, even if we were to die tonight, we wouldn't forsake you." And we see, obviously, that did not play out the way that they claimed it would. But that mentality is, I would say, crucial, and it's the mentality that the songwriter is expressing. Perhaps maybe you have some more historical background on this, but I would assume an allusion back to those missionaries that
that's exactly right.
He had met or had heard.
Yeah, it was more along the lines of with the wife's illness that, she put her health at risk staying over there as long as she did, to the point of where I don't think she died there, but I think their decision to continue to work together, she considered, I guess, her husband her best friend, which you probably should, and she was willing to work with him to the end if it meant that she would give up her life. And I think that's part of this is, and to your point, if I die upon a foreign field someday, I think that's what most people think of as, but if you stop and think about it, is like, it doesn't necessarily have to mean a foreign country. Yeah. I mean, it could be anywhere that we are proclaiming the gospel.
And kind of going back to that idea at the end of verse 1, that we're pilgrims. So in a sense, depending on how you want to look at it, wherever you are, you're in a foreign land.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It reminded me of Galatians 2:20 when Paul says, "I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live, I live in the flesh. I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." At the end of the day, even though we're living on earth, kind of like what you guys were just saying about, really we're all in a mission field, no matter if we're in a foreign country or not. But whether we run into different challenges, and in some cases, if we were to encounter death, like Paul said in another place, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So if we lose our life in service to him, then there's no greater honor. But it also, I think it almost like mentions this verse word for word in the verse of the song. It also reminded me of in John chapter 15. I'll start in verse 12, but really for verse 13, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. And we mentioned this a few podcasts ago, but that agape love, that sacrificial love that we must have for other people in the world, not only those that we currently know like each other, but also those that we want to hopefully be able to save one day.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to the verse, Revelation 2, verse 10, again, having that mindset and that dedication to Christ to be willing to die for him. But in the next part of the verse, and y'all might have some different thoughts on this, the next part of the verse, clearly the scriptures show that is the mindset that we need to have. But the next part of the verse where he quotes Christ as saying, if just a cup of water I place within your hand, then just a cup of water is all that I demand. I think that's kind of a reference back to Matthew 10:42, where it talks about if anyone gives one of these disciples a cold cup of water, he's going to be rewarded for it. And for me, what that kind of brings to mind is, yes, we need to have that mentality and that willingness to die for Christ, but all that Christ demands is all that we're capable of giving. And even if that's just a cold cup of water, then that's plenty and acceptable to him. I think it's in 2 Corinthians 8. Let me pull it up here. 2 Corinthians 8 8:12. It says, for if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. And so again, having that readiness, having that willingness to die for him, but recognizing that as long as we're doing what we can with what we have, that it's acceptable to him.
I think the other thing on the Matthew 10:42 and Mark 9:41, both of them say, when referring to the cup of water, he says, well, the person who does it will not lose his reward. It's not all of these grandiose things that I get going back to, look at what I've done, look at all this. It's some of the smaller things that are just as important, right? And it's the little actions that may not mean much to us, but to the person that is thirsting for a drink of water, I mean, just a cup of water is a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And even that's like, that kind of people are the ones that Christ really reached out to the most. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know what the author's purpose was in that, but I agree. I think that it's kind of referring back to those things. And it is like an important reminder, kind of to Ryan's point, that we shouldn't just focus on like this group of people, almost kind of like what Peter did in the book of Acts. But, we shouldn't be withholding our love and our humility to anyone, no matter what their background is.
Yeah.
And there's no reward greater than what we're ultimately going to get if we do remain faithful.
Right.
Also.
Right. And I think the last part of the verse just kind of reiterates those points again. But if by death to living they can thy glory see, I'll take up my cross. Going back to what you've talked about earlier, Ryan, Luke 9 and verse 23. I think it's Luke 9:23 where he tells us to take up our cross daily and follow after him. That emblem of suffering and shame. And he says, obviously Christ only expects of us, but we're able to give. And again, sometimes we focus, as y'all pointed out, so much on these big expressions of love or service that we don't think about the small things that we do. But again, having that mentality of, if this is going to help somebody see Christ, if it's going to bring glory to Christ, no matter what it is, even if it is death, I'll be willing to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You have anything else there on verse 3?
I do not.
Okay. Well, that is the song Follow Me. I think it's a really great song. We haven't sung it, I don't think, here in a little while, but maybe we'll sing it sometime soon. Next time you lead singing.
I'm just I don't think
no pressure.
I'm not singing this month, so it'll at least be November.
Yeah, well, it doesn't matter.
Maybe one of the song leaders is going to listen to this podcast and think of this moment. Be like, I'm going to lead that this Sunday.
Yeah, we'll see.
Or whatever Sunday you're listening to this.
Yeah, never mind.
Yeah.
Anyway.
it was good to have y'all. I hope that what we've looked at has been encouraging to you, gained a better understanding and appreciation of this particular song. As we talk about with all of these things, we always need to have an understanding of what we're saying and what we're singing in worship. I think that's a crucial aspect of our worship, because otherwise we're just saying words without any real meaning or heart behind it. So I hope that this has helped in that regard with this particular song. Were you about to say something?
I just think this is such a unique song that you can really like kind of feel the empathy, just whether you know the background of the author or not, just reading through the verses there. It's one that I think pretty much anybody
you can put yourself in those shoes. Yeah, exactly.
I think we've all like felt these ways. We've all felt like, we've complained.
Some of it reminded me of the song, and I can't think of it. It's the one where while others prospers, living in sin.
Oh, yes.
You know what I mean? Because it's like I'm dealing with all these. I'm trying to be the good Christian, and I'm dealing with all this stuff, but I see all these people living worldly and how prosperous they are. And then this song, he's like, man, I'm doing everything for you, and I'm not getting anything out of it. And I think we could find several songs, but this one, I agree. You can put yourself in at least one, maybe two, maybe all three verses and say, I've been there. I've had that attitude. I think of Job a little bit. But anyway, that's a good point, Robbie.
Yeah, it is. Okay. Well, again, glad that everybody tuned in. If you have questions or topics that you want us to cover, reach out. As Robbie already mentioned, you can email us at theconclusionofthematter@yahoo.com, or message us or text us or talk to us in person, however you want to do it. It doesn't matter to us. But we can consider now.
Tempted and tried.
Oh,
that's
tempted and tried.
Yeah. Finally got it.
Yep. All
Sometimes I got to go all the way through the song and come to the...
There's like certain songs that you're like, why do I not know the title of this? And
the end of this episode is becoming a real like Southern goodbye. We keep ramping up to the end, and then something comes up, and then we don't stop.
Okay, I'm done.
It was an old rusty something.
Rusty,
yeah.
Or Rusty Trusty,
yeah.
Okay.
Sure
was.
All right. For now, we can consider this the
conclusion of the matter.